Good evening, friends. We welcome you to the 39th edition of the Study Circle meeting. I request Mr. Srinivasan to give the welcome address.
Welcome to yet another webinar of our study circle. This is indeed a happy moment for us because today I have been given a pleasant task of introducing one of my old friends. Mr. Srikanth is known to many of us who studied in the law college at the same point of time. Srikanth joined, many of us were in the 5-year law degree in Dr. Ambedkar Law 1991. And there were many occasions where we could interact with him. Mr. Srikanth enrolled himself in the year 1991 and then joined the chambers of Mr. N.S. Varadachari, a known senior counsel and who had a very lucrative practice in the civil side. Mr. Srikanth is also related to, he is a nephew of Mr. M. Subramania Rao, who is known very well in counsels practicing in the HR&CE side. Mr. Subramania Rao, late Mr. Subramania Rao, is one of the doyens of the HR&CE bar. In fact, many of the Freemasons will know Mr. M.S. Rao very well. Srikanth is also a Freemason and is a member of Lord Justitia. Besides the legal profession, he is involved in a lot of charitable activities also. He is involved in the activities of Ramakrishna Mission. He is also a correspondent of a school. He has been an arbitrator in many matters. Today, let us listen to him. Over to you, Mr. Srikanth. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivasan,
Thank you.
having spoken nice words about me. I do not know how far I live up to your all expectations. And I thank the study circle for giving me this opportunity to share my experience, whatever limited experience I had all these days. As Mr. Srinivasan was referring, whatever little knowledge I have in this branch of law, I owe it to my uncle, mentor, and guru, Mr. late M. Subramania Rao. And he was practicing in this branch of law for more than 50 years, and singularly he was practicing only in this branch of law. No other matters ever came to his office, or he never undertook any other matter. And after his demise, myself and my junior colleague Mr. E. Ganesh is also in the block. I have been actively taking part in all the matters which he had. And it is with this background, I would like to share my experience. Good evening, everybody. I once again thank for the opportunity given to share my experiences. I would like to submit that the enactment HR&CE as it stands today had a checkered history, which goes to the very behavioral pattern of human being in their interaction in the society, spirituality, and religiosity. As it goes, philanthropists were always present in every form of society, in every sphere of life. It is only when misfeasance, malfeasance, and maladministration happens, the requirement of corrective measures becomes essential. And there, the official mechanism in the form of governance, interference by the state authorities becomes imminent. It is in this backdrop of things, I would like to trace in a brief way the legislation which started governing the religious activities, meaning every religious institution for its governance has to necessarily be backed by financial requirements in the form of properties, movable, immovable, etc. So in the governance of these, in the administration of these properties which were attached, endowed, etc., to religious institutions, misfeasance, malfeasance happened. So this is the point where the state started interfering, controlling, and also administering in lot many cases. So in this background, the first of the legislative the corrective measures or or regulative measures started in the year 1817, when the 1817 Regulation 7 of 1817 was enacted by the British to regulate the properties attached or endowed in any form concerning the maintenance and administration of religious institutions. Thereafter, in 1839, the said Regulation 7 was not all that effective, and gradually it was withdrawn, and a new regulation in the year 1839 was introduced. Thereafter came Act 20 of 1863, where the supervision of the temples were done by nominating trustees for the religious institution. And these two enactments, of course, did not cater to the requirement, and still there were a lot many areas which could not be covered. And therefore, at that point of time, Montague-Selford reforms took place, and a bill in Act number 1 of 1923, which was called Hindu Religious Endowment Board, was the first time formed in the year 1923. The supervision and control of the temple was put for the first time from the year 1923 onwards. Thereafter, Act 2 of 26 was enacted, and wherein there was a distinction made in the form of accepted temples and non-accepted temples. As I told, the entire enactment or whatever regulations are brought, it regulates, controls, and also the manner in which these enactments are enforced would gauge the level of the degree of interference in the administration of temple. So therefore, every situation demanded such of those legislation, and ultimately Act 1951, Act 19 of 1951 was enacted, and it was in vogue. Thereafter came the Constitution, and the protection under Article 25 and 26 was put into force. And thereafter, the first of the judicial declaration of as to what the religious freedom and religious rights of citizens came in the Sirur Mutt's case in AR 1954 Supreme Court 282. When this judgment was rendered, again it arose between conflict of two interested persons in a religious institution. It was not as if somebody as a public interest filed this matter. This arose from an inter-se dispute between two individuals who had a warring right claim over the institution Sirur Mutt. Therefore, there were proceedings where a person was demoted or dismissed or removed from service, and there arose the degree of interference. First, there was a question whether courts could interfere, and then thereafter up to Supreme Court it went, the dispute between two individuals. Ultimately, Supreme Court had an occasion to interpret Article 25 and 26, and in the process, the 1926 Act, which was in vogue previously, completely was watered down. So all these factors were taken into consideration, and thus the 1959 enactment, which is now in force. Now, this 1959 enactment also, the preamble of which it states, the preamble of 1959 Act, this Act, as the preamble states, is in recognition and consolidation of several previous enactments which were in force that were regulating the administration and governance of religious institutions. I'll read: an act to amend and consolidate the law relating to administration and governance of Hindu religious and charitable institutions and endowments in the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, this is how the present act came into being. The act vis-a-vis has classified the level of control over religious institutions for the secular aspects of the temple alone, because as we have seen that Sirur Mutt's case, where the religious freedom as contemplated under Article 25 and the consequent right which flows from such freedom under Article 26 to manage institutions of catering to the requirement of enjoyment of religious freedom together are found in Article 25 and 26. The enactment, which will the enactment HRNC 1959, will have to be read as if it doesn't interfere these fundamental rights which have been granted for religious rights which has been granted under Constitution. So therefore, having this in mind, the degree of classification upon which the institutions are regulated by the 1959 Act could be on 5 broad categories. Namely, the first one is private temple, second one is public temple, the third is mutt, fourth is religious endowment, fifth is charitable endowments, and sixth is notified and exempted institutions. I have prepared a small brief note which I will be sending it across after the presentation is over. So these are the 6 broad categories in my understanding of the Act where this 59 Act is supposed to regulate. Now, the administration and the exclusivity of the management of the temple will depend upon the nature and constitution of the said institution itself. Before going into our topic of unlocking the provisions of HRNC Act, I would briefly submit that the Act per se is applicable to the circumstances and the trappings which has been found in the definition clause, definition section, wherein there are about 24 categories have been made. 24 categories of definitions have been made. To, if any of the institution, religious institution, attracts any of these trappings, then the Act would be per se implemented to those institutions. 6 is a large section. It has 23 sections, 23 subsections. So therefore, these are the trappings. The Act itself says if any of the institutions attract any of these, of course, the definitions include the officials who are there under definition clause, namely additional commissioner. But I'll take one by one as to the mischief which an institution might incur to attract the provisions of the Act so as to come under the purview of the Act. Now, the first of the provision which I would like to take is section 4. Section 4. As I told, the topic seems to be topic which we have chosen is that unlocking the provision. And I'll first read the provisions where these institutions need not unlock the provisions of HRNC Act at all. For them, it is once and for all closed, and the provisions of the HRNC Act will not visit them. So let me first clarify all these categories of institutions for which the Act may not be applicable. So first of the section is which speaks about exemptions. The government may, by notification, exempt whether prospectively or retrospectively from the operation of any of the provisions of the Act or rules made under to any religious institution or religious or charitable endowment, or vary or cancel any such exemption, provided before doing that person has to be put on notice. Now here, the government in its wisdom, namely we are talking about a sovereign authority, even if it has all the trappings of a public Hindu religious institution, satisfying the entire gamut of definitions contained in 6, but still, in the wisdom of sovereign authorities, namely government, if some religious institution has to be left out from the purview of the Act by a notification, government is entitled to exempt such institutions. And we all know that in Chennai, Rajanamalapuram, MRC Nagar, Ayyappan temple is one such temple where the temple is exempted from the purview of the operation of the Act, though it has all the trappings of public, etc., comes under the definition. The next of the provisions which will exempt from the provisions of the Act is through the mechanism contemplated under the Act, which is contained in section 63A. Yeah, 63A comes under chapter 5, inquiries by the authorities constituted under the Act. 63, joint commissioner. Now it is joint commissioner or deputy commissioner, as the case may be. It was previously deputy commissioner. Now joint commissioners are the first authorities in the hierarchy of the department who make inquiries and render findings on these 63A subclasses, etc. Wherein 63A, it speaks about whether an institution is a religious institution. So if a person can establish filing an application before the Joint Commissioner under 63A and establish that the institution which is alleged, which is sought to be brought under the purview of the Act is not religious institution, then the sweep of the Act, the purport of the Act will not be made applicable. The Act itself will be not applicable to such of those institutions. So we saw sovereign exemption, we saw statutory exemption under the Act. The third one is filing a suit before a civil court for declaration of the denominal status of the religious institution and take a decree and grant a decree that the institution, religious institution, is a denominational institution. Under these three categories, we need not unlock the provisions of the HRNC Act. First one is sovereign authority. Second one is statutory authority under the provisions of the Act. Third one is through judicial process, which is a constitutional remedy. Now, I have briefly stated these things, and now we will get into the provisions of the Act. And these 63A and 26, I'll slightly go elaborate when I come to the respective portions. Yeah. Now, the first of the provision which I would like to touch is Section 6(5). Before going to that, Section 6 defines 6(1) is additional commissioner, 3 is assistant commissioner, 4 is board. All that is insignificant. So we'll come to 5. Charitable endowments. Charitable endowments means all property given or endowed for the benefit of or used as a right by the Hindu or the Jain community or any section thereof for the support or maintenance of objects of utility to the schools and said community or section thereof, such as rest houses, chowltries, patasala, schools and colleges, houses for feeding the poor, and institutions for the advancement of education, medical relief and public health, or other objects of like nature, and includes the institution concerned. Here, if one could see the definition made as charitable endowments, it nowhere speaks about concerning a religious institution. This speaks only about charity, and it speaks only about charitable endowments. The trappings of this definition clause is enforceable through Section 3 of the Act. Power to extend Act to charitable endowments. Where the government have reason to believe that any Hindu or Jain public charitable endowment is being mismanaged, they may direct the commissioner to inquire or to cause an inquiry to be made by any officer authorized by him in this behalf into the affairs of such charitable endowment, and to report to them whether in the interest of the administration of such a charitable endowment, it is necessary to extend here to all or any provisions of this Act and rules made thereunder. As I said, the power to extend to charitable endowments is even without a religious institution involved in it. All that is required, beneficiaries of a charitable endowment happen to be Hindu or Jain, though, as it has been stated in the definition column, schools, rest houses, institutions, schools, rest houses, 6(5), schools, patasalas, chowltries, rest houses and colleges, and house for feeding. Nowhere it says it is happening in a religious institution or in any of the temples or etc. etc. However, if the beneficiary of a charitable endowment happens to be Hindu or Jain, the mismanagement of which institution will attract the applicability of this Act. So this is a very all-sweeping provision. Section 3, literally it says that even if the activities of the charitable endowment strictly does not attract the provisions of subsection 17, 18 and 19 to be strictly called as religious endowment, still charitable endowment will be attracted under this Act if it happens that the beneficiary of some of which are Hindus or Jains. So that is the purport and teeth of this enactment, to extend even to non-religious institutional charitable endowments, charitable activities. So therefore, the mechanism contemplated there is Section 3. Now, next will be commissioner. Next definition is commissioner, subsection 6, commissioner means commissioner is appointed in terms of section 9 of the Act. An interesting facet as regards the commissioner in the HRNC annals of HRNC is concerned. The appointment made by the state under section 9 interestingly has a very wide sweep of including persons from judicial, higher judicial officers also could be appointed. I'll read the section. The government shall appoint the commissioner, additional commissioner, such number so and so. Appointment to the post of commissioner shall be by transfer from among the members of Tamil Nadu State Higher Judicial Service or Tamil Nadu Judicial Service or of any other service by from additional. Let us stop there. The present system of appointing commissioner is not happening under section 9, section 9(2)(a)(1). It was happening previously because I've heard Mr. Rao saying that Chinnaya Pillai was one of the commissioners who was a district judge, and the proceedings would be as we all know that judicial officer manning an inquiry. That was the difference which was made. But however, there is an anomaly by appointing a judicial officer, higher judicial officer in the rank of district judge as commissioner, because in the enactment, section 69, Siva, could you come to 69? In section 69 of the HRNC Act, where appeals from the orders passed in the provisions of inquiry, chapter 5, there is an appeal provision which says that the orders passed by the commissioner in excess of section 69 shall be before the court of original jurisdiction who has been named as the subordinate court in the district under section 70, which is a statutory suit. So, of course, I do not know when this anomaly was pointed out at that time, because a higher judicial officer of a state had been appointed as commissioner, and the orders passed by the commissioner were subject matter of subordinate courts having original jurisdiction in the respective district. Of course, the point is that though a judicial officer in the capacity of district judge is appointed, the excise was statutory. That was the that was the concession, or that was the reasons which we ourselves gave to come over this anomaly. Anyway, that is not happening now. So commissioner is appointed by the government, and the mode of appointment has also been given. So the option for the government even now is open under section 9(2)(a)(1) to appoint district judges as commissioners in the HRNC department. The next section which we would like to go is section 6(7). 6(7) means in relation to a math or temple situated in a presidency town, the city civil court at Chennai. In relation to a math or temple situated elsewhere, subordinate courts having jurisdiction over the area in which the math or temple is situated. In relation to specific endowment attached to a math, again which could be a court having jurisdiction as aforesaid. In relation to specific endowment attached to two or more, any court which. So here the definition of court under section 6(7) nowhere speaks about district court. Nowhere speaks about district court, but for the fact that in relation to MUT, 7 subclause 2 speaks to district court, because MUT is completely under the jurisdiction of commissioner. The disputes relating to MUT will be directly handled by the commissioner, and the appeal will lie before a district court. But in operation, as a regular practitioner, one would have encountered statutory 70 suits, namely the 70 statutory suit will arise from an order passed by the commissioner in excess of appellate authority under 69, in appeals filed against orders under 63. So though 63 orders would have been passed by the jurisdictional joint commissioners spread out throughout the state, however, appeal will lie only before the commissioner under 69. And when commissioner decides it under 69, appeal will go to the respective districts, subcourt having to the subcourts in the respective districts where the temple is situated. That is why court has been defined to mean that in Chennai it is so and so, but as far as the Math is concerned, it is district court. Now, the interesting point where court has been defined here to mean several courts which has jurisdiction, etc. Now, there was an interesting case which arose, which is reported in 2019 7 SEC 108, wherein the Honorable Supreme Court had an occasion. I mean, of course, several matters were there, and this is the first occasion where Supreme Court held that application of Section 5 Limitation Act is alien to the authorities constituted under the HRNC Act. The case arose this way, that 63B declaration for hereditary trusteeship is made only by the person interested. In most of the matters, there will not be respondents at all. It is only the family which will claim that they are the founders of the temple, that ancestors have founded and properties are dedicated. And when some interference was sought to be made by the authorities, they seek remedy as is available to them under the Act. One such remedy is 63B, asking for a declaration under for hereditary trusteeship. In this, almost 99%, there will not be any respondent. It is not tried as an adversarial dispute at all. So what happens? The inquiry will be conducted, and maybe the relief of declaration of hereditary trusteeship would be granted or dismissed, etc. If it is granted, if it goes on the premise that whatever the petitioners made was accepted, and upon proper evidence being tendered and the satisfaction of the Joint Commissioner's jurisdictional, grant of status of hereditary trusteeship in a temple is given. Now, if there are some rival claimants who happen to discover this proceedings, who are not respondent, I mean, we do not know, even if 3 or 4 branches might claim hereditary trusteeship in a temple. But however, the person who filed it might have filed from one of the branch or 2 of the branches, leaving the other branches, not even putting them on notice. If this grant is made, and the other branches who are legitimately entitled to the office of hereditary trusteeship come to know about it at a later point of time, when they file an application to recall or set aside, or even file an appeal as provided under 69, then usually the appellate authority will condone the delay when we file Section 5 application. Now, in this matter, all along up to High Court, it was said that Section 5 was applicable and the delay were condoned. But the trustees who held office pursuant to such a declaration took it to Supreme Court that the delay could not be condoned. Supreme Court, after analyzing Section 6 and subsection 7 and the definitions of court under various other provisions as is found in this Act, have held that since the authorities exercising jurisdiction under the HRNC Act are not strictly judicial authorities to be called court, therefore the exercise of Section 5, which is available as per Limitation Act, is only to the judicial authorities and should be properly constituted judicial court. Since these authorities under the Act do not satisfy to be called a judicial court, application of 5 was said to be not available to the proceedings in the HRNC. Therefore, of course, this judgment still holds good. But as I said, the reasons in a given case, in a genuine case, before going to that, the HRNC, it's very peculiar that schemes framed under Section 64 alone is gazetted. At least we can say if an office is declared as hereditary trustee, public notice has to be given or gazetted, etc., etc. A deemed notice could be inferred on a person who challenges it later. But however, in these proceedings, there is no deemed notice. Only if the person comes to know that he is also entitled, or anybody for that matter, because as we know, the deities in the temple are perpetually minor, and any person interested, even a worshipper who can say that the declaration obtained by a person as hereditary trustee has no connection at all with the temple. All these matters would depend upon the person who alleges or the challenge correctness of the order passed in a declaration of hereditary trusteeship. We might not know that the knowledge which he had should be within a period as specified in the appellate case in 60 days or 30 days as specified in the appellate provisions in 69. So therefore, the date of knowledge alone will be the criteria. All that has to be looked into is the allegation made by the person assailing such an order that on only such date he got the knowledge of the order only could be the criteria. But unfortunately, the present state of affairs is that limitation for section 5 is not applicable. Therefore, limitation as prescribed for filing an appeal against the order passed under 63, namely 30 days or 60 days, whatever prescribed in 69, appeal to the commissioner within 60 days. Appeal to the commissioner is 69, wherein it says any person aggrieved by the orders passed by joint commissioner in exercise of so and so authority should file it within 60 days. As I said, in a genuine case where a person who has to be, who was not considered because of the petitioner's non-impleading as a respondent, or a genuine legitimate claim of another branch of hereditary trusteeship had been deliberately let out, and they might as well might not have known the proceedings. Therefore, when they come to know, they assail the orders, and then the 60 days limitation is strictly pressed into service. So we file section 5 application to condone the delay. Now this is not available. In this scenario, the proper application, in my humble opinion, is that Article 58 and 59 of the Limitation Act alone could be the proper criteria, provided, as I said, with the rider, that the person alleging at a later point of time genuinely establishes the fact that he came to know for the first time of such an order passed by the authority, and therefore it immediately on coming to know, he had approached the authorities for setting aside or for revision or whatever it is. Therefore, the present scenario is that the Honorable Supreme Court has held that Section 5 is not applicable to the proceedings before the HRNC authorities, because they strictly are not conforming to the definition code. Now we move on to Section 6(9). Executive officer means executive officer means a person who is appointed to exercise such powers and discharge such duties appertaining to the administration of religious institutions as are assigned to him by or under this act, or the rules made thereunder, or by any scheme settled or deemed to have been settled under this act. Therefore, now a closer look at the scope and purport of executive officer shall reveal that means a person who is appointed. Therefore, is appointed as executive officer with such powers. So it is not omnibus. Executive officer will have to discharge his duties on the delegation of such powers and discharge such duties appertaining to the administration of religious institution as are assigned to him. This is very important. He is a delegate. He is a delegate with a specific agenda appertaining to the respective religious institution. So therefore, 3 criteria. So every religious institution within its fold will have its own ways and means of distinguishing factors of manner of worship, manner of offering of worship, and distinguishing devotees with the various variegated performances of rituals and other related temple activities. Therefore, it says duties appertaining to the administration of a religious institution as are assigned to him by or under this act, or the rules made thereunder, and by such schemes settled or deemed to have been settled under this act. Therefore, it is very clear that the EO is a person appointed with a specific assignment in a particular religious institution under this act. So the appointment of the executive officer is governed by Section 45 of the Act. Now we'll go to Section 45. Notwithstanding anything contained in this Act, the Commissioner may appoint, subject to such conditions as may be prescribed, an executive officer for any religious institution other than a mutt or specific endowment attached to a mutt. In this section, mutt, as I said, it's completely under the purview of the commissioner. Now, in normal parlance, we have seen in temples that executive officers have been appointed as a matter of routine. But the Act says that the appointment of executive officer is for a specific purpose and with a specific delegation in a religious institution which appertains to the requirement of such officer being in office. Therefore, the underlying purport of this section is that the executive officer is required if only the management, usually with the trustees, could not be effectively done in a temple, and that his role will be in the form of assisting the administration of the temple, because temple administration is done by the trustees only, and they are the permanent body which are going to govern the temple. Only in such cases where the administration requires an additional officer from the HRNC department in view of the properties attached or the management of which requires a supervision, depending upon the degree of interference which is permissible, which again depends upon the nature of the temple, executive officers are appointed. Now, this executive officer, since it is a delegate, there were delegate by the commissioner or the officers attached, there was no such rules prescribing till 2014. The Act, though, came into force in 1959. The rules of appointing executive officers were not made at all. This ultimately, the Supreme Court in Chidambaram Temple's case, in Subramaniam Swamy, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy was a state of Tamil Nadu, reported in 2014 5 SEC page 75. The Supreme Court found that though the Act prescribes the executive officer as a delegate with a specific assignment, executive officers could not be as a matter of right appointed, as a matter of routine appointed. We have seen that the executive officer, if appointed, the order will include as to what are his functions and duties. But that is not the purport of the Act. That is not the purport of the Act as found in section 45, as well as in the definition contained in section 6(9). Therefore, there should be a rule upon which only an executive officer will be appointed. Now, after this judgment of the Supreme Court, the government of Tamil Nadu had passed GO MS 260 religious tourism and religious endowment department, governing regulating the rules for appointment of executive officer. And this is one aspect of appointment. Now what happens? The executive officer is a government servant who is appointed by virtue of the Act. However, when an executive officer is assigned to a temple, his perquisites are paid from the coffers of the temple. So therefore, the temple is burdened with additional financial burden to pay the executive officer from the contributions made by devotees or endowments available. Therefore, the Act only sees this as a delegate. It is not a permanent office, which, as we find now, is happening in the temples and all. Therefore, executive officer's role is only to assist the trustees in the efficient functioning of the temple, and also to a greater extent manage the affairs of the properties of the temple, directly to be reported to the commissioner for ever so many purposes. Now, apart from this, the contribution which has to be paid will also be monitored. Even otherwise it will be paid, but executive officer's role is to manage the affairs of the secular aspects of the temple without in any manner interfering with the religious activities of the temple, particularly for the properties and endowments attached to the temple. So this is the scope and purport of the executive officer. But in practice, it is completely different. As we see in temples, they are appointed as a matter of routine. And now that only the rules have come into force from 2014 onwards, and this allotment of temple funds as perquisites and financial outflow for an officer is certainly adding burden to the institution. So this aspect will have to be this aspect will have to be looked into further as to the need of the executive officer. It is only when the it is only to assist the trust board in the administration of the temple. It's only a supplementary and not completely essential office. When this again I am telling, in a temple which is managed by trustees, or in a scheme temple where there is already a board of trustees in operation. However, in respect of other temples where there is no board of trustees, or it's completely a government temple where the founders are not, the founding nature of it is lost in antiquity, and it has been continuously being managed by the officers appointed with HRNC, then it's a different scenario altogether. Even then, the attachment, endowment attached to such temples will be manned by minimal staff, so that the expenditure and outflow of the income from the temple is sought to be kept at the minimum with maximum governance. See, this is the scope and purport of executive officer. Now, what happened in Chidambaram case? In earlier round, when the executive officer was appointed to Chidambaram temple, it was challenged, and ultimately the executive officer, the Dikshitas successfully challenged, and it is reported in 1952 1 MLJ 557, as a fallout of which 1952 1 MLJ 557, as a fallout of which the present judgment in the year 2014 5 SEC 75 also came into being, and consequently the rules are now in place for the appointment of executive officer. The next provision which we see in the line of definitions are section 611. Hereditary trustee, the definition means the trustee of a religious institution, the succession to whose office devolves by hereditary right, or is regulated by usage, or is specifically provided for by the founder, so long as such a scheme of succession is in force. Here again, the trappings as to what a person claiming hereditary trustee has to prove is that the office devolves hereditarily and is regulated by usage, or is specifically provided by the founder. If the founder himself, in the instrument of founding or any document of trust or endowment, specifies the manner in which the succession to the office of hereditary trusteeship has to be done, it could be done. Otherwise, it is being followed in the manner regulated by usage of that particular temple, or hereditarily devolved. Now, in this case, the hereditary trusteeship will have to be declared by the authorities constituted under the Act, namely in the inquiry by the Joint Commissioner, which is in section 63B. 63 deals with Joint Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner to decide certain disputes and matters subject to the rights of suits or appeals hereinafter provided. Joint Commissioner or the Deputy Commissioner, as the case may be, shall have power to inquire in decide the following disputes and matters, namely, A, we have seen that whether religious, B, whether a trustee holds or held office as hereditary trustee. There are two limbs to this inquiry. First of all, the office in a religious institution is hereditary in nature, and that the person claiming the office to be hereditary held the office in a capacity as hereditary trustee. These are the two aspects which has to be decided. And as I said, mostly in most of the cases, it is a non-adversarial proceeding where there are certain procedures contemplated under the Act. The independent authority, namely the jurisdictional inspectors of the HRNC department, will depose in evidence, collect materials to whether to justify or to or deny the claim of the person claiming to be hereditary trustee. And of course, the local inhabitants and the neighbors of the temple and worshippers, etc., would depose in evidence whether supporting or opposing the claim made by a person, and an order is passed either declaring or rejecting. This is where, when a declaration is made, it is not made public at all. It is not made public at all. Therefore, it is in my humble opinion that now that in the digitized world, it could be uploaded and kept in the compilation of judicial orders or quasi-judicial orders passed by the temple authorities in the respective district also, or a notice board could be in the temple notice board. When a new hereditary trustee or a new board is appointed by quasi-judicial authorities, namely joint commissioner or commissioner, it could be put on notice so that any person claiming tomorrow that the orders have been passed behind his back or he was not heard, at least a constructive notice could be attached on them, whoever assails at a later point of time. But that mechanism available. The next important facet in hereditary trusteeship is there arose a question whether a body of persons could hold the office of hereditary trusteeship. This question arose in a matter which arose from Nanganallur, Vedastapa Sabha, which is managing a temple named Hayagriva Temple, where the society was registered under the Societies, the body of individuals were registered under Societies Registration Act. And they under the temple with the funds generated by the members of the society. They bought a piece of plot, and they were instrumental in building up a temple, which is there from 1980s onwards. What happened? They obtained a declaration that the Vedastapana Sabha is the hereditary trustee of the temple. Vedastapana Sabha as hereditary trustee of the temple. However, there were litigations and it went up to Supreme Court. In every stage, there was a difference of rendering of verdict. The single judge of the High Court accepted the version when it was set aside by the commissioner that the appeal suit was decreed, holding that Vedastapana Sabha as a Sabha could hold the office of hereditary trusteeship under 63B. However, on further appeal by the HRNC authorities in LPA, it was overturned, holding that a body of individuals could not satisfy the definition of hereditary trustee, since it is only by inheritance and it is individualistic. Therefore, it could not be held. The society was held to be a body of individuals with fluctuating body. Therefore, a fluctuating body could not be declared to be a hereditary trustee. However, it went up to Supreme Court, and ultimately Supreme Court held that a fluctuating body could not hold the office of hereditary trusteeship. And as it stands today, a fluctuating body or a body corporate or a body of individuals, though founding the temple, could not have the benefit of becoming a hereditary trustee and to have their succession also recorded because of the judicial pronouncements and declarations made in this Vedaprartha Sabha's case, which is reported in 2004, 3 CTC, page 536. Now, this opens up a very important question, namely, in case the founders who are a collective body, of course, a body is always fluctuating. With officers, they have their own manner of electing the office bearers from the society, which will have members on it, which has a right to admit, and that right will depend upon the allegiance which the individual member seeks to seek membership in the society, which is manning the temple, which a peculiarity which it is distinct from others. However, this body, since was held to be not competent to hold the office of hereditary trusteeship, there is a huge vacuum now, and that after having founded the institution, they are left without a proper remedy. Of course, the remedy presently available is only to go before the Joint Commissioner under Section 64 and get a scheme framed for the administration of the temple, wherein they will recommend the trustee and the government will recognize. So this is the level of importance which the statute confers upon a body of individuals who are instrumental in founding the very temple at all. So the effective protection or the governance right is wanting in this aspect, where a body of individuals founding a temple with their own resources and from the members of their society. Now it's a big lacuna which the statute is yet to address. This is my sincere understanding of the provisions where the hereditary trusteeship right could also inure to a body of. It doesn't mean that hereditary means only an individual has to inherit the office of from his forefathers, but a body corporate, which is a corporation soul and which has a perpetuity, it is going to be there. The office bearers are going to be filled in at the expense of the previous office bearers. He is competent to hold the office of trusteeship. If it is so made, there will be a lot of institutions who will get proper protection of being hereditary trustees in temples and will have the satisfaction of governing the temple in an efficient manner, because their rights as founders will be more fortified with the lesser governance and interest from the department, from the HRNC. But unfortunately, as it stands today, a body founding the temple will have to go only before, if they are able to satisfy that they are denominational by themselves, then it is a different question altogether. But as it stands today, the non-suiting of the Veda Prartha Sabha, that they could not hold the office of hereditary trusteeship because it's a fluctuating body, makes them remediless, and all that they could do is only get a scheme framed under section 64(1), as they have done after the Supreme Court held that they cannot hold the office. The trappings of hereditary trustee has all been judicially propounded, wherein 3 criteria have been stated for a person to successfully claim the office as hereditary and for him to be declared as the holding the office of hereditary trustee in a temple. The first is that a broad guidelines which has been laid in judicial pronouncements, which I'll later share it. 100 years of the temple being founded, or 3 generations of administration of the temple, or any other mode which is prescribed by the founder. Unless these 3 minimal categories are satisfied, a person cannot successfully get the declaration of a hereditary trusteeship. And now, having spoken to about the hereditary trusteeship, we will now move on to trustees, which is in definition 622. Trustee means any person or body by whatever designation known, in whom or in which the administration of a religious institution is vested, and includes any person or body who or which is liable as if such person or body were a trustee. So here the trustee's definition, as found in 622, the hereditary trustee, as we found that it encompasses the founder's intention to go generation wise or by usage and practice, etc. Now, in case of a trustee, again in Veda Prartha Sabha's case, which we referred, the body of individuals being fluctuating cannot hold the office of trusteeship. Now, the trusteeship in a temple usually will be under 3 categories, namely hereditary trusteeship is completely a different class altogether, because that right is accrued by inheritance and by the nature of the institution which has been founded. Other trustees, the manner in which it is being appointed in the temple, are found under section 47, 49, section 47 and 49, and section 64. Section 47 and 49, where a religious institution included in the list published 46, or in respect of assistant commissioner, has no power to appoint trustees, has no hereditary trustee, so therefore hereditary trustee is carved out. Now, section 46 deals with temples which are categorized. Can you go up? Yeah, 46. Yeah, 46 is the category where the list is published by the commissioner to include certain temples which are listed for the purpose of collecting contributions and for the services which the officials of the department render to the temple, which is categorized. One could see that the annual income, the temple classification under section 46 is made on the basis of the income that is generated by the temple. It could be seen that the commissioner shall publish a list in a prescribed manner, a list of the religious institution whose annual income as calculated for the purpose of levy of contribution under subsection 1 of section 92, 1 less than 10,000 rupees, but is less than 2 lakhs of rupees, is less than 2 lakhs of rupees, but less than 10 lakhs of rupees, and not less than 10 lakhs of rupees, and may from time to time modify such list in the prescribed manner, provided so and so, so and so. So now what happens when a temple is listed? These three categories, namely three slabs of income generated, will determine the officer who is competent to appoint the trustees. And in case of non-listed temples, the assistant commissioner has jurisdiction. So now coming to section 47, which deals about listed temples. So again, the classification which has been made on the basis of the revenue generated by the temple is the basis upon which the trustees are appointed here. The trustees are appointed. Of course, the amending act subsequently has included the participation of a lady member and members belonging to scheduled caste and tribes under section 47. Section 47. These appointments usually are made to the temples where the management of it is completely vested in the department of HRNC department. Unlike a hereditary trustee temple, or unlike a temple governed under the scheme framed under section 64, these are the temples where directly the trustees are appointed. Depending upon the income generated, the officers at that category will be the competent persons to appoint non-hereditary trustees. The tenure of the trustees are usually 2 years, and the more interesting factor here is section 64 also specifies appointment of trustees. So there are three categories of trustees now under the act, namely one is hereditary trustee, another one is trustees which are generally appointed for temples which are directly under the governance of the temple, and the third category is the trustees who are appointed in terms of a scheme framed under the act. Yes, power of joint commissioner, deputy commissioner to settle schemes. When the joint commissioner or deputy commissioner, as the case may be, has reason to believe that in the interest of proper administration of an institution, a scheme should be settled for the institution, or when less than 5 persons having interest make an application in writing, stating that in the interest of proper administration of the institution, joint commissioner, as the case may be, shall consult in the prescribed manner the trustee and the persons having interest, and after such a consultation, he is satisfied that it is necessary to or desirable to do so, he shall by order settle a scheme of administration for the institution. Here, the scheme once settled, the trustees are appointed. After the scheme is settled, the scheme temple, the scheme as it is will devise the manner of administration of the temple, including the administration by a board of trustees who will comprise of persons from the scheme temple, and they will be nominating, they will be recommending the names, and the HRNC department, whosoever the joint commissioner or the appointing authority, is only recognizing the trustees who are nominated by the board of trustees or the scheme temple in their conglomeration, which usually call as Mahasabha. The Mahasabha's recommendation in a scheme temple will be to recommend the names, and the government will approve the recommended names to be appointed as trustees. And here the trustees appointment in a scheme temple is governed by subsection 2, and the proviso speaks that provided in making any provision in the nature specified in clause B, due regard shall be had to the claims of the person belonging to the religious denomination for whose benefit the institution is chiefly intended or maintained. So here again, the autonomy of the particular denomination which was instrumental in founding the temple has been given precedence in the appointment of trustees under the scheme temple. Here, what happens? This religious denomination, in case if the religious denomination could not get a declaratory decree before a civil court under Article 25 and 26, the next available option for them is to get a scheme only. The scheme decree gives a limited autonomy of nominating trustees for the administration of the temple pursuant to the scheme which is settled by the Joint Commissioner and which is gazetted also. It becomes a public document. Now, the appointment procedure here is that the Mahasabha will recommend the names of the persons of their own denomination, and it is recognized by the government by recognizing it as a trustee being appointed and issuing appropriate orders. Now, before going to that, the hereditary trustee who is in office, if a vacancy arises by way of the hereditary trustee being passing away of hereditary trustee, it is covered under section 54 of the Act. 54 of the Act. Filling up of vacancies in the office of hereditary trustee. When a permanent vacancy occurs in the office of hereditary trustee in a religious institution, the next in line of succession shall be entitled to succeed to the office. So usually on the demise of a hereditary trustee, the next in line of succession, namely the legal have a right to file an application under section 54(1), and the process of accommodating the next in line has been held to be administrative in nature. There is no adjudication at all. This has been settled. All that they need to make is an application, and there is no need for any inquiry and all, provided they furnish proofs that they are the next in line of succession. And it has been held to be an administrative act, and it is not an adjudicatory act, which is being reported in 1991 Law Weekly, page 44, which is famously called as Premanand's case in the practitioners circle, that recording of next in line of succession is automatic, and it is only administrative in nature, as is held in this judgment. And as we speak about hereditary trustees, there has been a category of trustees in village temples, in small village temples, where hereditary trustees themselves will be pujaris also. Hereditary trustee cum pujari is a known facet of administration in small village temples. Of course, it is no more in vogue. Because of several judicial pronouncements and also amendment to section 55. The pujariship is no more heritable office. Now, hereditary trustee cum pujari in small village temples were prevalent for quite some time. However, which has been judicially recognized and also acknowledged by various of the pronouncements in the courts. One famous judgment is that 1964 1 MLJ 384, where the right of administering the temple as pujari also, trustee also, has been recognized to the pujari himself. And of course, this arises in small village temples, and such of those administration is now becoming extinct. Next of it is pujariship in a temple, where it was previously pujariship in a temple itself was hereditary, leave alone whether the pujari is a trustee cum hereditary pujari, or pujariship itself in the temple where previously hereditarily inherited. Father will be pujari, his son will be pujari, the next line succession will automatically go into the office of, hold the office of pujariship, until in 1971, Act 2 of 1971 was legislated to do away with the hereditary pujariship in temples, and which was upheld by the Honorable Supreme Court in the case reported in 1973 1 MLJ page 58. The Honorable Supreme Court upheld the Act 2 of 1971, stating that it does not in any way infringe the religious rights of the person. It only appointment of pujari is only a secular function, and therefore there is no infringement of religious right. And Act 2 of 1971 abolishing the hereditary pujariship was upheld. That is reported in the famous Sesham Mal's case, and thereafter hereditary pujariship has been done away with. Now, the next provision, we will again come to 47 and 49. 47 trustees, 47 and 49 trustees are completely in the purview of appointing authority, namely the authorities constituted under the Act. But where again the trustees appointed in such temples also should be given precedence from such of those denomination or community which was instrumental in founding the temple, which guarantee is assured in section 51 of the act. Claims of certain persons to be trustees. The government, the commissioner, the joint commissioner, deputy commissioner, assistant commissioner, in making appointment of trustees under section 47, 49 or 49A, as the case may be, shall have due regard to the claims of persons belonging to the religious denomination for whose benefit the institution concerned is chiefly intended or maintained. So this is the one recognition given to such of those persons who are instrumental, though they may not hold any office or they may be unconnected with the founders, but still some forefathers or the community or denomination which might have been instrumental should be given due consideration while appointing trustees under 49 and 47 and 49, even under 51, which claim which consideration has to be made, as has been found in section 51 of the act. Yes. Now we will come to the qualifications and disqualifications of the trustees. Qualifications and disqualifications of trustees. Section 25 capital A. Section 25 capital A. Qualification of trustees. A person shall be qualified for being appointed as and for being a trustee of any religious institution or endowment if he has faith in God, if he possesses good conduct and reputation and commands respect in the locality in which the religious institution or endowment is situated, if he has sufficient time and interest to attend the affairs of the religious institution or endowment, if he possesses such other merits incidental thereto. Disqualification of trustee. So here a person shall be qualified for being appointed as trustee. It has been specified, namely he should have faith in God, etc., etc., if he has sufficient interest. So therefore 25A prescribes a qualification at the time of applying for the office of trustee or at the time when a person is considered for the appointment of a trustee. Now, interestingly, disqualification of trustees is found in next section, namely 26. Section 26. Disqualification of trustees. A person shall be disqualified for being appointed as and for being a trustee of any religious institution. This the wordings of the section would give out a meaning that for being appointed or and for being a trustee, meaning a sitting trustee, a person presently holding the office, how incurs disqualification or had disqualification earlier or had been disqualified, presently not in trustee, which will be a disqualification for his future appointment under section 25A. So the wording of the section is it takes into account the past conduct as well the present conduct of a person who is holding office. If he does not profess the Hindu religion, maybe the person while being appointed might be a person from Hindu religion. Thereafter, if he had converted, he incurs disqualification. If he is not a citizen of India, in the case of hereditary trustee, if he is less than 25 years of age, if he is an undischarged insolvent, etc., etc., there are lot many infirmities. But what is these are the regular categories which is required. But what is interesting here is that if he is not a citizen of India, namely 26(1)(b), 26(1)(b, it is not seen. It is not also understood why the statute. Of course, this provision was not there. If this provision was not there when the 1959 Act originally came in. There was no bar for a non-citizen to be appointed as a trustee in a religious institution. However, post amendment, I think it was somewhere in 1979 or somewhere it was amended, 73 or 79, this clause has been inserted. Now, as we have seen, that that in Tirumandiram, there is a famous verse where in every Shiva temple, while concluding, they say that தென்னானுடைய சிவனே போற்றி எந்நாட்டவர்க்கும் இறைவா போற்றி அண்ணாமலை எம் அண்ணா போற்றி. So எந்நாட்டவர்க்கும் இறைவா போற்றி தென்னாடுடைய சிவனே போற்றி. This is what Tirumandiram Tirumular has revealed, that எந்நாட்டவர்க்கும் இறைவா போற்றி தென்னாடுடைய சிவனே போற்றி. Therefore it transcends a religion which transcends universally, and the Hindus professing faith in gods in Hinduism are spread over throughout universe. But I do not know why a non-citizen is disqualified from holding the trustee in the Abbey temple. Of course, it is a food for thought. Anyone could debate on this. The correctness of having such a provision in the enactment will definitely require debate, at least in the coming future, where the tenets and other religious renderings of all the saints in this part of the country, praising the gods of the Hinduism, have all not made any distinction. It is universal, moksha universal, God universal, and even the God is seen as if Anbe Sivam is how we have been taught. Therefore, I do not know what is the reason behind this Indian non-citizens being not competent to hold the office of trusteeship in a temple. So now, thereafter, we will come to next of the section which we are going to see concerning the trusteeship will be section 107. Section 107. Act not to affect rights under Article 26 of the Constitution. This provision, nothing contained in this act shall, save as otherwise provided in section 106 and clause 2 of Article 25 of the Constitution, be deemed to confer any power or impose any duty in contravention of the rights conferred on any religious denomination or any section thereof by Article 26 of the Constitution. When this provision, when Constitution confers certain rights on religious practices, the Act in section 107, as if it magnifies and states that such of those rights granted, conferred under constitutionally under Article 26 shall not be contravened or shall not be disturbed by any of the provisions of this section. The purpose and the object of this section slightly is not, I'm not able to understand. But as I said, when the denominational the religious denomination who are instrumental in founding in a group or a class of persons are not able to get a concrete protection under the provisions of the Act, and they are only relegated to go before the Joint Commissioner under section 64 for framing of a scheme, and still are open and amenable to the control or of the interference of the HRNC authorities. This is where the protection which the section 107 guarantees, which flows from Article 26, is slightly infracted, or rather the body of individuals in a denominational temple are remedialess today, and it is a gray area, despite section 107 assuring that none of those rights which are granted under Article 26 could be infringed or will be contravened or in any manner infracted with, is the guarantee given under section 107. This area requires further research and also judicial overview to see that a body of individuals having instrumental in founding an institution though not be able to satisfy the stricter definition of a denomination, but are left without remedy despite an assurance under section 107. This is my understanding, that this requires, I think, further jurisprudence would certainly ensure such benefits and slighter anointment or anointment from the incidence of this application of this act. And the next provision which will go is section 616. Section 616 religious charity means a public charity associated with Hindu festival or observance of a religious character, whether it be connected with a mud or temple or not. So the definition, religious charity, speaks that the charity which is supposed to be conducted is religious in nature, irrespective of whether it is in a religious institution or not. The sweep is slightly wide. Observance of a religious character, whether it be connected with the mat or temple or not. And next, the religious endowment. I mean, religious charity is the charity which the definition speaks, and endowment is the one which certain properties are earmarked for performance of such charity. Religious endowment or endowment means all property belonging to are given or endowed for the support of mats or temple, or given or endowed for the performance of any service or charity which is specified in 616 of a public nature, connected therewith, or of any other religious charity, and includes the institution concerned and also the premises thereof, but does not include gifts of property made as personal gift to the archakas, service holders, or the employees of a religious institution. Therefore, religious charity and the place and the property earmarked for performing religious charity are covered under section 616 and 17. And we'll now go to section 619. Specific endowment means any property or money endowed for the performance of any specific service or charity in a mat or temple, or for the performance of any other religious charity, but does not include an inam of the nature described in explanation 1 to clause 17. So therefore, specific endowment, all the three, namely section 16, 17 and 19, speak about a charity which has been incorporated, and an endowment for which in the manner of property is being given to it, an endowed property for religious purposes, and also for a specific endowment. So all the three aspects have been covered: religious charity and property endowed, and the endowment may be specific also for a particular charity. All these three are covered under the HRNC Act, and the authorities will have authority to exercise supervisory control over these matters, provided the charity is attracts any of these three definitions. And then the definition of 20, section 20, temple. Temple means a place by whatever designation known, used as a place of public worship, public religious worship, and dedicated to or for the benefit of, or used as of right by Hindu community or of any section thereof, or as a place of public religious worship. So the definition of a temple encompasses three distinct features to be called a temple, namely use as a place of public religious worship, and a dedication for the benefit of the Hindus as a right of worship, and also the place is, therefore the place, if satisfies as a public religious worship, therefore a place where public as a matter of right are entitled to offer worship satisfies the definition of temple. Of course, there are several other facets which has been documented in the form of various judicial precedents, judicial pronouncements, where temple, whatever features, etc., has been looked into. But the plain meaning of the definition of temple, as is found in subsection 20 of 6, is that it should be a public place of religious worship, where the place is dedicated for worship of the Hindus, and it is a public religious place of worship. The catch is that public religious worship, to bring it under the purview of section 6 subsection 20 of the HRNC Act. Now, as we saw in the initial stages itself, before before the unlocking of the provisions of the HRNC Act, that there are three circumstances under which the application of the HRNC Act could be completely done away with from the institution. As I said, the first one is Section 4, which is done by exemption granted by the sovereign authority, namely government. Second is through statutory authority, getting a declaration and 63A. And third is getting a decree through civil court of declaring themselves as religious denomination of the rights granted under Constitution, namely Article 25 and 26. Now, the distinctive feature in all these three reliefs is Section 4, though it might be a place of public religious worship, all the three factors, public religious worship, still it could be exempted. And 6, next one is denominational character declared by a competent civil court granting the relief under Article 25 and 26 can also be a public religious, a place of public religious worship. These two categories satisfy all the three limbs, public Hindu religious worship. However, a small distinction could be made when the act is not made applicable if a declaration under the statutory authorities contemplated that act which is granted under 63A, where again it is a public religious place of worship. However, the worshippers do not have a right of worship as a matter of right. That is the subtle distinction between all these three categories, where the act is not enforced. In case of a declaration under 63A, it has all the trappings of a temple. However, the public, as a matter of right, could not worship in the temple. That is the subtle difference. Though you satisfy all other things, you has the trappings of all in a temple. However, this subtle difference. Therefore, the three categories. So now, public religious institutions, as to what has been subject matter of various pronouncements of judicial authorities up to Supreme Court, where there was a presumption, there was an imaginary presumption rather, that temples in this part of the country, namely southern part of the country, were usually public temples, and the person who claims it to be not a public or a private was supposed to prove the contra. So this was the I would say even a misnomer which was holding all along up to 2003. This arose when in a judgment in AR 1920 Madras 42, an honorable judge Seshagiri Iyer J in a brief note had held, of course, on a plain reading of that judgment, 2003 1 CTC, plain reading of the judgment does not give such a meaning. But however, all along there was a presumption which was considered to be existing, though non-existent, that apart from the Tharwad, in Malabar Tharwad, where private temples are prevalent in large numbers, in all other places the temples were construed to be public in nature, and whosoever alleges the contrary, the onus or the burden of proof lied on a person who approached the authorities to get a declaration that they don't come under the purview of the act, or it is a private temple. This presumption ultimately got resolved in a celebrated judgment of the Madras High Court in 2003 1 CTC, page number 65. 2003 1 CTC, page number 65, where their lordships take the pain of analyzing various pronouncements earlier made in this regard. Of course, this arose on a 63A petition, where the onus of proof that the person alleging that it is a private temple is the one who has to prove, held it contra, particularly dispelling this misnomer of that AAR 1920 Madras had held that temples in southern India are construed to be public in nature, and the contrary will have to be proved by the person who wants to establish it as a private temple. It has been done away with. Their lordships have taken pains and have explained that that was not the obiter made by Justice Seshagiri Iyer in AAR 1920 Madras, and they have also extracted the findings of AR 1934 Privy Council 230, wherein the Privy Council had an opportunity to discuss the correctness of the obiter laid down in AR 1920 Madras 42, and have held Justice Edge as discussed as to what Seshagiri Iyer has held, and has said that it is only an observation. There is a presumption. What the judge had felt that Dharwad, Malabar part of the southern India had a number of private temples in its fold. Beyond that, the judge doesn't say that the temples usually in this part of the country are all public in nature, and that the contrary view which the person has to establish, it is on his onus to prove. And their lordships have also extracted the portions in the previous judgment where that a person being permitted to offer worship in a temple by itself does not confer a right to worship on that person. So they have held that no Hindu will prevent any worshipper coming and offering in their temple, howsoever private, howsoever public. No Hindu will prevent another Hindu from entering into a temple and offering worship. But that facet of permitting a person to offer worship in a temple by itself does not confer any right to worship on the person who is permitted. Therefore, their lordships hold that the permission granted to offer worship is a facet of Hinduism, and it had been happening only as a leave-in license, and that cannot be construed to hold that the person offering worship has a right to worship in the temple. And therefore, the fundamental trapping which is required in a private temple to be established is that it is not a place of public place of worship. Therefore, the main test which has been laid to ascertain that whether it is a place of public worship is that the person coming and offering worship has any right of offering worship there was the first principle upon which a place of worship is found to be a private temple or a public temple has to be decided. So these are the judgments where in AR 1981 Supreme Court 798, the Honorable Supreme Court had an occasion to deal, and in this judgment only the Supreme Court holds that any Hindu will not permit other person from entering howsoever a private temple to offer worship. That permission to offer worship by one Hindu of another Hindu does not by itself confer a right of worship on the other person who is being permitted. So this facet of looking at a situation to decide whether a place of worship is a public or private could not be done in henceforth. Therefore, their lordships in 2003 1 CTC 65 have done away with this misnomer equivalent, which was almost holding forth to the extent that all temples are usually public. However, the person alleging the contra has to prove. Now, the latest of this judgment is 2017 1 CTC 212. 2017 1 CTC 212. This arose from a temple at Annanagar. This proceeding arose from a temple at Annanagar, incidentally filed section 63A petition and to declare that the temple is not coming under the purview of the HRNC Act. However, both the authorities, namely the Joint Commissioner and the Commissioner in the appeal, declined to grant the declaration. However, when it was in the statutory suit, the declaration was granted, and the appeal was filed by the HRNC authorities, which is the reported judgment A974 of 2015, Ayyappa Seva Samajam Annanagar versus the Commissioner of Hindu Charitable Religious Endowment Board, where the Honorable High Court holds that the extracts all these judgments, all the gamut of judgment has been established, as what should be the test to find out whether a temple is a private or a public temple, and whether a declaration sought for under 63A, how could be granted, when could be granted, what is the degree of evidence that is required. All these have been elaborately discussed, and it is the judgment, latest judgment of 2017, wherein the Supreme Court, AR 1981 Supreme Court has held that the cardinal point to be decided is whether it was the intention of the founder that the specified individuals are to have the right of worship at the shrine, or general public, or any specified portion thereof. Saying so, the Honorable Supreme Court has held that the mere fact that members of public are allowed to worship by itself would not make an endowment unless it is proved that the members of the public had a right to worship in the temple. Therefore, the fundamental requirement appear to be dedication and worship by public as of right. The other aspects, namely architecture, existence of undials, distribution of prasadam, etc., can only be taken as indicators and not as essentials, which will affect the character of the temple or determining as factors. So therefore, this is the present scenario as to when an application is made under section 63A, and not to attract the definition as contemplated under section 620. Now, next provision will be section 613. A mat means a Hindu religious institution with properties attached thereto and presided over by a person, the succession to whose office devolves in accordance with the direction of the founder of the institution or is regulated by usage. As we know that mat, how it is different from a religious, from a regular temple, is that it has properties and it has a founder at whose direction the next in line of succession to the office, namely the Matadipati, is created. Therefore, mat slightly stands different from 620 definition of a temple, and therefore the regular pattern of applicability of the other provisions of the Act is restricted in the case of mat. Mat directly comes under the administrative purview of the commissioner, unlike the other religious institutions which has the trappings of the administrative superintendents of the other ranks of administrators, namely joint commissioner, assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner. Mat is directly coming under the purview of the commissioner's purview for the purpose of administration. The next, section 618. Section 618. Initially, when we saw the definitions of religious charity, religious endowment, specific endowment under section 6, 16, 17, and 19, are all encompassing of a religious observance with a property endowed for the purpose of such a charge has to be performed. If it is performed in a temple, then it becomes then it takes the shape of religious endowments, and in specific endowments there need not even be a place. All that it is required, it has a trappings of a religious religious charity or performance of rituals connected to some specific purposes in a religious institution. Then it becomes specific endowment, which again has the trappings of mischief contemplated under the Act to be brought under the purview of the Act. Now, in section 618, religious institution means a mat temple. So we have already had the definition of temple under 620. Religious institution widens the scope and ambit and brings it several other institutions also into its fold and purview. Religious institution means a mat is also separately defined, temple also separately defined, specific endowment also separately defined, and a samadhi or Vrindavan. These are later inclusions, namely frequently this inclusion of samadhi and Vrindavan have been happening, and sometime it was deleted, and now again it is incorporated. Religious institution, after religious institution as per section 6 subsection 18 includes three of the earlier defined institutions, namely Mat, temple and specific endowments, and includes Samadhi or Vrindavan or any other institution established or maintained for a religious purpose. Explanation for this purpose, again explain. Samadhi means a place where mortal remains of a guru, sadhu or saint is interned and used as a place of public religious worship. Vrindavan means place established for maintained the memory of guru, sadhu, saint, used as a place of public religious worship. So therefore, the trapping in all these definitions is public religious worship. Now, section 618, section 618 religious 618 religious institution, religious institution, the trappings of which could be ascertained by the inquiry contemplated under chapter 5, which is coming in section 63. Again, we'll go to section 63. 63, as we saw, A 63A, we have already seen that a declaration to the status of a religious institution as to whether it is religious institution at all or not. B, whether a person holds hereditary to that extent. The third one, C, whether any property or money is a religious endowment. So, to find out whether a property attracts the definition contemplated under section 618 and of the other definitions under section 616, 17 and 19, an inquiry is contemplated under section 663C to find out whether any property or money is a religious endowment, which religious endowment we saw is religious endowment is we saw under section 619, 617. So whether 617 is attracted or not is the purport of the inquiry contemplated under section 63C. And next comes D, section 63D, whether any property or money is a specific endowment. Again, we go to find out whether the definition under section 619 is attracted or not by an inquiry under section 63D. And the next one, F and G. F and G, of course, E is of course customary rights which emoluments etc. It is that doesn't has anything about the definition. F and G is a composite charity. Whether any institutional endowment is wholly or partly religious or secular in character, and whether any property or money has been given wholly or partly for religious or secular uses. And G, where any property or money has been given for the purpose of an institution which is partly of a religious and partly of a secular. So therefore, this is a composite thing where in the same disposition in the endowment, which might have religious as well as secular trappings to be performed in a religious institution. Therefore, to find out all this, an inquiry has been contemplated, and the appropriate authority will be the Joint Commissioner with the original authority to find out whether to what part of the endowment answers the designation of religious in nature and what is secular in nature, and such orders could be passed under these two sections. Therefore, the purport of section 16, subsection 16, 17, 18 and 19 will be answered through the inquiries conducted in section 63, A, B, C, D, F and G. Now, after coming to this 63 inquiries, as we found that any of the trappings which are found defined section 6, thereafter on inquiry, the Joint Commissioner might hold or might not hold whether they attract the definition contemplated under 6 under the various categories. Now, the remedy for the person who whether got the relief of declaration, the adversary might file appeal, or relief which is sought under 63 is negatived. The next avenue will be appeal to the Commissioner under section 69. 69, the 69 interestingly opens up with any person aggrieved by any order passed by the Joint Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner, as the case may be, under any of the foregoing sections of this chapter speaks about inquiries, chapter 5, may within 60 days from the date of the publication of the order or the receipt thereof by him, as the case may be, appeal to the commissioner, and the commissioner may pass such orders thereon as he thinks fit. So therefore, it is not stated in the section that aggrieved person to appeal, any person aggrieved. The terminology is that any person aggrieved. Maybe the any person meaning here that the person need not be necessarily a party to the litigation upon which this appeal is filed. Any person aggrieved. Now, the any person aggrieved has a special connotation, in this regard, as I already stated, that in most of the declarations of hereditary trusteeship, there may not be respondents at all. Therefore, the right of appeal is given to any person. Therefore, the locus standi here is not necessarily that a person who has been a party and suffered an order adverse to him need not be the person who may be appealing against. If any person aggrieved by an order passed can file an appeal. This assumes more significance because the deity in a temple, namely the idol, has been recognized as a perpetual minor as far as the application or the interactions of the temple vis-a-vis the common man or whomsoever interacts with the temple. Since the idol is held to be minor as a legal status, any person who is interested in the affairs of the temple, which is defined in section 615, I will come to that later. Person aggrieved. Any person having interest in the affairs of the religious institution could espouse the cause on behalf of the deity because he is a minor. Legally he is a minor. Therefore, all the trappings of a contract which a person has with a minor, the same implication will be there in cases where a person has an interaction with the temple, if it is not being backed by suitable authorities, namely the minor being represented by adequately held officer or trustees who is competent to represent the minor idol. So therefore, the interactions of any person with the religious institution, maybe with the trustee or the authorities, mean officers appointed by the authority, has to first satisfy that the person who represents the idol is really competent to have the interaction with the person who is dealing with the affairs of the temple. Mostly the temple properties are being now auctioned, are being given on lease, etc., etc. Therefore, the competence of the person to represent the minor idol assumes significance. Now, therefore, only the appeal to the commissioner starts with any person who is aggrieved. Now, we'll turn back to, for a moment, we'll turn back to definition contained in subsection 15, 615. Person having interest means A, in the case of a disciple of a so-and-so. B, in the case of a temple, a person who is entitled to attend at or in the habit of attending the performance of worship or service in the temple, or who is entitled to partake or in the habit of partaking in the benefit of the distribution of gifts thereat. Therefore, the definition is very, very loosely worded so as to include more and more persons to be entitled to represent as person having interest. This is so because, as I said, the idol is a minor, and therefore persons who are partaking in the benefit of the distribution of gifts, etc., who are offering worship or service in the temple are all given the locus standi to question the correctness of any decision taken by the temple authorities. And therefore, now after reading this, any person aggrieved who will file an appeal in section 69 will be more of significance. So therefore, a person who with the leave of the court, who with leave of the commissioner files an appeal, questioning the correctness of the order passed by Joint Commissioner under Section 69 will satisfy the definition that he is an interested person under Section 615. Therefore, he is any person aggrieved as is found in Section 69. This is the reason is very obvious, and 69 is a power appeal to the commissioner. Section 69(1). 69(2), any order passed. 69. Let's go to 69(2). 69(2), any order passed by Joint Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, as the case may be, in respect to which no appeal has been preferred within the period specified in subsection 1, may be revised by the Commissioner so moto, and the Commissioner may call for and examine the records of the proceedings to satisfy himself as to the regularity of such proceedings or the correctness, legality, or propriety of any decision or order passed by the Joint Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, as the case may be. Any such order passed by the Commissioner in respect of an order passed by the Joint Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, shall be deemed to have been passed by the Commissioner on an appeal preferred to him under subsection 1. So therefore, an omnibus and sweeping power has been given to the Commissioner as a corporation soul of this entire department, that he can call for any of the records, and scrutinize the correctness, propriety, legality, etc., and he can render a finding on himself as if it was filed, as if it was rendered in an appeal. Interestingly, this section does not, Section 69(2) does not prescribe any time limit for excising this suo moto. The act as it is silent as to when, as to within what time could this suo moto power be excised by the Commissioner. See, the non-specifying of the time limit in excising this suo moto, in lot many cases, orders passed even 5 years, 10 years, 15 years have been subject matter of suo moto revision. Though the section is worded, any order passed in respect of the period so and so may be revised by the Commissioner suo moto. Suo moto revision means it is suo moto done by the Commissioner without anybody's insistence. But in operation, as practitioners before the HRNC authorities, suo moto applications are filed by parties. As I said, in case 3 or 4 branches who are legitimately entitled to the office of hereditary trusteeship have been left over by one branch, and behind their back some declaration has been obtained, they may come to know after a long period. So their right of appeal, which is only 60 days, having expired, now they can always invoke suo moto powers under Section 69(2) to rectify an order which has been passed behind their back. And they can, if they still satisfy that the order impugned is not correct, not legal or valid, or it lacks propriety, legal judicial propriety, then the Commissioner usually revises it. So this is how it is being done. So now in this context, to hold that the authorities constituted under the Act are not simpliciter court might in such circumstances do a lot of injustice to the really affected persons who have been left over genuinely, and who genuinely come to know after a long period, after the expiry of the statutory 60 days period, which has been contemplated under Section 69(1). Another interesting facet as to why this suo moto doesn't have limitation is that, as in the restrictive clauses of limitation prescribed under the Act, as we see in Section 34 of the Arbitration Act, 3 months and thereafter with proper explanation of 30 days, and not thereafter, the restrictive clause. There is no such clause found in Section 69(1). All that it says within 60 days. And the next power to Commissioner under 69(2) says suo moto he can revise any orders, and without specifying any limitation or period within which the Commissioner has to do. It is a double-edged weapon. In most in appropriate cases, it may result in justice or otherwise also. But here is a case where the peculiar aspect which has to be noted in such of those cases is that section 68 of the Act, section 68 of the Act, 68, yes, 68. 68 says the Joint Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner to forward copies. The Joint Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner, as the case may be, shall within a week from the date of his order made under any of the foregoing sections of this chapter, namely orders passed under section 63A, B, C, E, F, G, etc., to the order under any of the chapter, forward a copy of such order to the Commissioner. Of course, the section says that all the officers subordinate to the Commissioner will immediately mark a copy of all their proceedings to the Commissioner within a week of passing such orders. Here, this could be construed to cloth notice on the Commissioner of he having taken notice of an order passed by his subordinate officials in a particular given topic within this chapter. Therefore, the non-existence of a time limit for exercise of suo motu by the Commissioner under section 69(2) ought not to have been there in the light of the provisions contained in section 68. We often press this argument before the courts. What they say is the statute for some reason or the other has not specified any time limit for suo motu exercise. Therefore, we cannot now substitute or interject into it of any time limit which the statute itself does not in its wisdom has not contemplated. But however, when such of those matters which have been put to test for want of filed within limitation or in the suo motu, there arises a frequent question when the absence of any time limit specified for Commissioner to exercise suo motu, what will be the reasonable time? So the reasonable time, there is no reasonable time at all. As I said, it is a double-edged weapon. It might even do justice or otherwise. So therefore now reasonable time of what for exercise of suo motu has been the subject matter of judicial pronouncements and declaration in various of these judgments. 2010 2 MLJ 272. The Honorable Court says when exercise of suo motu provision powers under section 69(2) as to what will be the reasonable time within which the Commissioner has to exercise this power. Likewise, 1994 1 MLJ, page 155. The S.A. Ponnuswamy's case is a very famous case. And there are two other judgments which says that the exercise of suo motu at any distant point of time will depend upon the peculiar circumstances of each case, and it could not be blanketly specified that it is only under such contingencies it could be exercised and not in other contingencies. Therefore, these are two judgments which says specific cases. 2001 2 Law Weekly 783, 2001 2 Law Weekly 783, and 1970 2 MLJ 453. All right. Now, we have seen that the trappings of the definitions covered under the Act is being attracted or not attracted. Parties are now have tested their capacities before the competent authority, namely original authority, Joint Commissioner, and he has passed orders. We have seen that it has been taken on appeal or the Commissioner revising it. The next comes the stage that after that there is a statutory suit provided under section 70. Statutory suit under section 70. Any party aggrieved. Here again, any party aggrieved. It doesn't restrict that a party to the proceedings aggrieved. It is any party aggrieved by an order passed by the Commissioner under subsection 1 or 2 of section 69 and relating to any matter specified under 63, 64 or 67 under section 63, 64 or 67 so and so may within 90 days from the date of the receipt of such order by him institute a suit in the court against such order, and the court may modify, cancel such order, but it shall have no power to stay of the order of the Commissioner pending disposal of the suit. Any party aggrieved by the decree of the court under subsection 1 may within 90 days from the date of the decree appeal to the High Court. So here again 90 days time has been granted to file a statutory suit against the order passed by the commissioner in excess of section 69, both 1 and 2, all the matters covered under section 63 declaration, which has directly satisfied the definition or doesn't satisfy the definition of section 6. Now, interesting case arose in the statutory suit. There has been a hovering question which has been doing for rounds for some time, is that when a suit is filed under section 70 against the authorities, namely Commissioner HRNC, Joint Commissioner HRNC, etc., etc., since they are statutory, since they are sovereign authorities, statutory authorities, whether a section 80 notice is required or not before filing section 70 suit. This was doing for rounds for some time, and ultimately this question was also resolved by 2 or 3 of the very renowned judgments in 1985, 1 MLJ 82, 1998, 2 MLJ 50, 2007, 6 MLJ 309, where their lordships held that section 70 statutory suit is a continuation of the proceedings from the authority, and there is no need for giving any section 80 notice, since it's a proceedings which is continuous, and therefore now we have reached the stage of coming to the civil court of a proceeding which emanated from the quasi-judicial authorities under section 63 or ever so many other provisions. Now we are before the statutory suit. Statutory suits now are being conducted as if it is filed under Order 7 Rule 1 in a regular suit which we file and seek declaration. But interestingly, the prayer in the suit which we usually do here is the prayer, as I read to, any party aggrieved may seek against such order of the court, may modify or cancel such order, but it shall not have power to say, that is interregnum, modify or cancel such order. Meaning, if in case I had filed an original application OA before the first authority, namely Joint Commissioner, seeking myself to declare as hereditary trustee in a temple, which has been declined, which has been confirmed by the Commissioner in appeal, and now I am before the civil court by way of a statutory suit. Now what happens if the suit is decreed? My OA is answered in the affirmative. But however, the wordings here, it says cancel, may modify or cancel such order, but it shall not have. Therefore, ultimately the civil court will see the correctness of the orders passed by the quasi-judicial authorities, hierarchical quasi-judicial authorities in the HRNCE, and ultimately grant or conform with the findings of the authorities.
Honorable Mr. Justice Govindarajan is also here.
Yes,
Just unmute him. Sir, you are
Good evening.
unmuted, sir.
Good evening, my lord. Good evening.
Good evening, brother.
Good evening, my lord.
MS Rao tried to teach me in HRNC, but he failed.
I'm also in the same category.
He said you won't.
Thank you very much, sir.